Hello my quilting friends! Welcome to this quilting basics video all about free motion quilting. My name is Leah Day and this is one of my biggest passions. I absolutely love free motion quilting, but I know that it can be a real struggle to get into and learn from the ground up. So we're going to jump in step by step together. Let's first learn how to move our quilt, how free motion quilting works with a very simple design called stippling. To get started free motion quilting, I'm going to drop my needle down and then bring it up to the point where the needle is starting to drop back down again. And I give that top thread a tug and that pulls up a loop that is my bobbin thread. And I do that every time I start quilting, whether it's free motion quilting or walking foot style quilting. So now I want to stitch these straight lines. I'm going to create like a little outline and then quilt some designs inside. And this is a good opportunity for you to start experimenting and getting the feel for free motion quilting and understanding how this works. Basically, the machine is not doing any of the work for you. Instead, your hands are pushing the fabric forward. They are responsible for the movement. So if I don't move my hands, if I take my hands off the quilt, then the quilt is not going to go anywhere. And for this reason, anytime that you aren't moving your hands, you want to stop the needle going up and down. Just take your foot off the foot pedal, take your foot off the gas, because anytime that you're stitching and not moving, you're forming a knot on the back of your quilt or the front. So always watch out for that. It can be quite noticeable, and it's one of those things that as you get started, it can be really easy to just kind of pause, and you might be thinking about where you're going next, and you not even be realizing that your machine is continuing to run, you're continuing to stitch. So always connect pressing down on the gas with moving your hands. And notice how smooth and steady I'm moving this. It is not a race, and it definitely is one of those things that going slower with your hands can definitely help. Now let's talk about stitch length, because obviously the machine is not controlling this. Our hands are controlling this. So whenever I want big stitches, I move my hands fast. And you notice that I'm running my machine at roughly the same speed. So here are my stitches. You see how they're noticeably bigger than before? It's because my hands were moving very fast, but my machine was running relatively slow. So that's how I produce big stitches. Now if I want to produce small stitches, I'm going to move my hands very, very slowly, hardly at all, and continue to run my machine at the same speed. So here, my stitches got so super tiny. If I had to rip these out, that would be a real pain because they would take forever and they're so small I can barely see them. So part of the process of learning free motion quilting is learning how to balance the speed and movement and learning how to produce kind of medium-sized stitches. And really there is no set stitch length here. There's kind of just, it's one of those visual things. You kind of have to just look at it and go, is that pretty to me? Or do I think those stitches are a little bit big? Or do I think that they're a little too small? There's no right or wrong way to do this, in short. There's no right or wrong stitch length. And I've never taken a ruler to my stitches to check them. The one thing to keep in mind is that because this is something that is hand guided, your stitches are going to fluctuate. So you might have, like let's say you're just getting started and your hands kind of push hard in that very first stitch and then you get back on track, you're going to have a big stitch there. And that's okay, that happens. You're going to have fluctuations sometimes in your stitches where they go from small to big. Some days you're going to have days where your stitches tend to be big and some days your stitches tend to be small. It's really funny that way. But free motion quilting is one of those techniques where the machine is not doing the work for you. You're doing all the work. And I hope that this is maybe a little comforting in that don't expect your stitches to all be the same size and length when you first get started. So a little bit about settings. This is something that can be very confusing for a lot of people. When I set up my machine for free motion quilting, I put a turning foot on my machine. A turning foot is designed to hover over the surface of the quilt. This one hops ever so slightly. You can see it has a little bit of movement to it in the mechanics of the machine. Some feet just hover and some feet hop a lot. So kind of look at your machine and see what darning foot that you have. And when it comes to stitch length, I set my stitch length all the way down to 0. And what this means is that the feed dogs, the little teeth on the machine, that are down here that help feed fabric forward, those little teeth are not moving very much at all. So by setting my stitch length to 0, I don't have to drop the feed dogs. But if you like to, and dropping the feed dogs is something that you're used to, then go on ahead and do that. It's good to understand that there are multiple ways to stitch in free motion, and you don't have to do it in any set way. I find that setting my stitch length to 0 and not dropping the feed dogs produces a nicer looking stitch. So now let's talk about actually free motion quilting some designs. This is a design called Stippling. It's very, very popular for free motion quilting. And as you can see, it's just basically a wiggly line that wiggles around and doesn't cross itself. So those are kind of what I call the rules of the design. It's a very flowy, wiggly design. And notice how as I'm quilting, I'm forming these shapes, and sometimes I'm slowing down and speeding up as I form them. Like I know that that shape feels very natural to me, so I'll oftentimes put my foot down and speed up and then slow down whenever I'm forming a shape that I might not be able to see as well. So this is a design that has a very simple rule, but sometimes it can be a little struggle to get used to it. So here's a good place to get started. The simplest form of stippling is just to make U shapes. So just think of like the letter U or the letter N in cursive, and just go up and down, back and forth, just like that. And that'll kind of get you into the flow of stippling, just making that simple curving line. So do that for a few rows, just to get the hang of it. And then as you kind of pay attention to your boredom. As you get bored with this, then go, okay, well, how can I change it maybe a little bit? Maybe add a bend to it. So curl one up a little higher and bend it around, and then stitch a smaller U shape, and then curl the next one up and around. So you can see by doing that, we've just made it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more freeform. When you're free motion quilting, especially for the first time, this might feel like a struggle because you're doing so many things at once. You are moving the fabric, and you're completely in control of moving the fabric. You are also pressing your foot pedal down and trying to keep the speed of the machine in time with the movement of your hands. And you're trying to think of the design all at the same time. And that's a lot of things to do. So one tip that I always give beginners is to mark the design. So in all of my patterns, I've included practice worksheets plus actual quilting diagrams for you to mark your blocks, for you to mark your quilting design on the fabric. So that way you can be quilting, instead of having to focus on so many things at once, you can be quilting along a marked line and not have to think about it. So here I've just drawn on some stippling, and I'll show you the difference. When you have a marked line to go off of, it's funny, it's kind of like just having some guidelines to aim for, and you don't have to be perfect because those lines will be erased. They will erase out of your block, so you don't even have to be perfect at it. You can quilt off the lines if you have to, and that's a-okay because those lines will erase and no one will know that that's where you meant to stitch, and your quilting will look that much better for it. So if you find stippling to be a struggle to get into, first start with those wiggly U shapes. Just begin there and just stitch rows of that back and forth across a practice sandwich, and that's just going to get you into that flow, into that rhythm and movement. And then as you get bored with that and feel like you can move on to something more challenging, start bending it around and curling it into itself and adding more wiggles and bends. That's how you make it more interesting. And then, of course, if that is still a struggle, mark the design on your fabric and just quilt on the marked lines, and that's the easiest method to go with. Now, one other thing about free motion quilting that I think is important is your path that you take as you quilt. So if you'll notice, and go back and watch from the beginning of the video, I always work in a pattern from left to right and then down a bit, and then from right to left, or I rotate the block and work straight down. So let me show you and kind of emphasize this. I work in rows because it works really well for my brain, and it stops me from getting stuck in a corner. So a lot of times when you work really randomly, like let's say I started right smack in the middle of this block and just worked around randomly, I could very easily fill in one corner completely and leave a whole corner empty and not be able to get into that area and fill it in. So by working in rows, like here I've just completed working all the way to the right, and then now I'm going to fill straight down, kind of filling right down to that bottom edge. And as I start filling downward, I'm also working my way back to the left. This works a little bit like writing. You know, you fill in the lines of a piece of paper. You know, you don't start in the middle of writing a piece of paper and work out from there. It would be too random. So by doing it this way, you can see what you're doing, you know where you're going next, and you never get stuck in a corner. You never get lost in the design, which is really, really helpful. So here I'm finishing this up. And one thing that you might also notice as you're quilting stippling is you might notice jerkiness. So instead of smooth curves, you might have more jerky stitches. And if yours is looking something like this, it could be the size of your stitches. It could also be the movement of your hands. And so keep that in mind. If yours doesn't look like mine, number one, that's perfectly normal and it's nothing to be ashamed of or intimidated by. This is a learning and growing process. But here are a few tools that can help you along the way. Number one, I always wear gloves. These help me get a grip on the quilt so that way I can move it and position it easily. I never lose traction on the fabric's very smooth, and if I just use my plain hands without gloves, oftentimes my hands are just sliding over the surface and not able to actually grip it. Another thing that I use is on the machine bed itself, and this is a Supreme slider. And it has a hole right in the center that you position right over the hole in your machine. And what this does, it does a couple things. Number one, it's very slippery, so it helps the quilt to slide and glide more easily on the quilt, on the machine surface. So it doesn't feel hard to move. So that helps a lot. And then this also minimizes the contact between the feed dogs and the back of your quilt. Those are the little teeth that move your fabric forward. And remember, you have a choice between dropping them or just turning your stitch length down to 0 like I do. Now, a lot of people wonder, okay, well, if the feed dogs are up, do they tear up the slider? And you can see this area does get a little chewed up over time, but I've been using this one for over a year and it's really not that bad. So I think it can take it. The one thing to keep in mind is that a Supreme slider is a very delicate tool. You can see it's only the thickness of a couple sheets of paper. It's not very thick and you can stitch through it. So just make sure to keep it clean. Every once in a while, take it off. And on the pink side, rinse it under your sink faucet and let it air dry. And that will keep it free of lint, so it will stick really nicely to your machine bed and it won't lift up. One last tool that I use inside of the machine, and this just helps my thread to look better and feed better, and it is a Little Genie Magic Bobbin Washer. It's basically just a small washer, and this works in both side loading cases like this one and top loading. So what you do is you take the washer, you pop it in, and then you wind your bobbin just like normal. If this was a drop-in bobbin, I would do the same thing. I would drop it down into the case, put the bobbin on top, and wind it just like normal. So what the bobbin washer does is it helps fill in those little gaps between the bobbin and the bobbin case and helps to reduce thread breaks. Like, you know, if, let's say your bobbin thread got tugged really hard and the bobbin span backwards, that is backlash, and it can cause a really nasty knot on the back of your quilt. So the bobbin washer just helps the bobbin thread to glide as smoothly and evenly as your top thread. And I use them in all my machines all the time. So I put them in and pretty much forget about them. I change them once a year at the new year so they don't get too worn out. So those are the tools that I use for free motion quilting. But I would say ultimately the number one thing here is practice. Make a stack of practice sandwiches like these. This is just a 9-inch square and I marked a 7-inch square in the middle. And if you quilt one of these every single day, I promise you, you will see enormous, enormous change in your skills and abilities within only a month. Because as you quilt and gain more experience, you'll be able to understand how to hold the fabric, how to position your hands, how to use the speed of your machine, and to keep these stitches balanced. This is one of those techniques that is very, different when it comes to anything that you use your sewing machine for, and your machine is not doing the work for you. And because of that, it's going to take a little bit more practice, a little bit more patience in order to get the hang of it. But I'm sure that you can definitely master it. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoy learning more about free motion quilting. This is one of those techniques that can be a little challenging because you're using your machine in a totally different way, in a very unusual way, because of course we're not using those feed dogs and they're not feeding the fabric forward. Because of that, you might see some ugly stitches, and that's totally normal. The quilt might also feel completely out of control. So definitely invest in those extra tools that I mentioned in this video. Give those a try, and you'll definitely see some improvement. The more you quilt, the better you'll get, I promise. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any new quilting videos coming out every week. Until next time, let's go quilt.